Take a breath with me for a second. I want to talk about Adam and Eve in a way that does not depend on shame, fear, or a literal reading that turns the story into a cosmic crime report. I want to talk about it as something much closer to our everyday experience, something you can actually test in your own mind. Because if you strip away centuries of arguments, the story has one strange center point. It does not say they were expelled from Eden because of sex. It does not say they were expelled because curiosity is bad. It says they were expelled because they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That detail is either meaningless or it's the whole message. So let's look at what knowledge of good and evil might actually mean. Most of us hear that phrase and think morality, rules, behavior, right and wrong. But notice something. The moment you create a rigid map of good and evil, you also create a new kind of me. You do not just say, this action helps life. You say, I am good because I do it. You do not just say, that action causes harm. You say, they are evil because they do it. And right there, a separate self is born. A self that must protect itself, justify itself, improve itself, defend itself, prove it is on the right side. A self that needs enemies to define itself against. A self that needs to win. Now, I'm not asking you to take that as philosophy. Just look at your experience. Think of a time you were completely absorbed in something. Music, running, working with your hands, playing with a child, watching a sunset. For a few seconds, you were not narrating yourself. You were not curating an identity. Life was just happening. Then a thought appears. How am I doing? Do I look okay? This is good. This is bad. I should be better. They should not be like that. And suddenly you are back inside the little mental room called me. The story of Eden can be read exactly like that. Eden is not a location. Eden is a way of being. It is the state where experience is direct, simple, unified. Before the constant internal judge shows up. Before you split reality into me and the world, good and evil, worthy and unworthy. Then comes the tree. The tree is not a botany lesson. It is a symbol for a very specific inner move, the move from direct being into conceptual division. Knowledge of good and evil is not just knowing that fire burns or that kindness feels better than cruelty. It is something subtler. It is the compulsion to label reality in a way that strengthens the sense of separation. It is the habit of cutting life in half and then living as the one who must manage that split. You can feel it in the body, the tightening, the heat, the righteousness, the fear, the need to attack or defend. And once that happens, the kingdom of heaven is not visible anymore. Not because God is punishing you, because you are not looking from the place where heaven is. You're looking from the separate self. Look at what happens in the story right after they eat. They suddenly feel shame, they notice nakedness, they hide. And God asks a question that is almost funny if you hear it the right way. Who told you that you were naked? In other words, where did that judgment come from? Where did that self-consciousness come from? Where did this new inner voice come from that turns simple being into a problem? Before the bite, nakedness is just a fact, like an animal, like a child at the beach. No story, no shame. After the bite, nakedness becomes a moral concept, a label, a threat, a reason to hide, a reason to feel separate. That is the fall. The fall is not falling down from a place in the sky. It is falling into the mind that divides. And the consequences make sense. Once you live as a separate self, life becomes struggle. Sweat of the brow, pain, competition, fear of scarcity, fear of the other, the constant need to secure yourself in a world that now feels outside you. And here's the part that is really delicate. If the knowledge of good and evil creates the separate self, then what happens when that separate self tries to fix the world? It does what it always does. It seeks good, it fights evil. It builds identity on being good and defeating evil. And for a while it works. It creates progress, it creates laws, it stops some harm, it builds civilizations, it creates periods of peace. But then, Because the separate self is still running the show, it swings back. It needs an enemy. It needs someone to blame. It needs a new evil to justify its next crusade. It needs the emotional fuel of opposition. And we repeat the cycle: liberation and slavery, war and peace, health and sickness, hope and collapse. Not because human beings are hopeless, because the root assumption remains untouched. The assumption that I am a separate self in a world of separate selves, and reality is fundamentally split into us and them, good and evil. Now, I can already hear the immediate objection, and it's a fair one. Are you saying we should not fight injustice? Are you saying we should not stop torture, killing of innocents, genocide, abuse, exploitation? No, I'm not saying that. I am saying something more uncomfortable and more practical. There are two ways to respond to harm. One way is from ego, and one way is from what the Gospels call the kingdom of heaven, the state of inner unity, the end of the illusion of separation. Ego-based action looks like this: I am the good one. They are the evil one. My anger proves my righteousness. My hatred is justified. If I destroy them, the world will be clean. This kind of action can sometimes stop immediate harm, but it quietly plants the seeds of the next harm. Because it dehumanizes, it hardens identity, it creates retaliation, it teaches the nervous system that violence is the answer. It keeps the world split, and it keeps the separate self alive. Kingdom-based action looks different. It still acts, it still protects, it still confronts, it still sets boundaries, it still restrains violence, but it does not need hatred to do it. It does not need the story "I am good and you are evil" to move. It does not feed itself on the emotional high of being right. It's more like a surgeon removing a tumor, very firm, very clear, not confused about harm, but not personally addicted to vengeance. This is the point many people miss. If you hear "drop good and evil" and interpret it as "be passive," you are not hearing it deeply enough. The invitation is not to stop acting. The invitation is to stop acting from the hallucination of separation. Because as long as we are acting on behalf of the separate self, even our best intentions get twisted. Even our justice becomes revenge. Even our morality becomes self-worship. Even our movements for peace become a new war. You can test this in small ways, which is where the truth always becomes obvious. Think of a conflict in your personal life. Maybe someone betrayed you. Maybe someone disrespected you. Maybe someone lied. Notice how quickly the mind turns it into a moral identity story. I am right. They are wrong. I'm good. They're bad. And then notice what happens inside you. You do not become free. You become tense. You become obsessed. You replay conversations. You imagine revenge. You imagine proving them wrong. Even if you win, you do not return to peace. Because peace is not a trophy the separate self can win. Peace is what is left when the separate self stops running the show. Now zoom that up to nations, ideologies, religions, tribes, movements. The same mechanism scales. The world becomes a battlefield of identities, each convinced they are fighting evil, each convinced they are the hero. And the story keeps eating itself. So what is the Bible pointing to when it says the knowledge of good and evil expelled us from Eden? It is pointing to the birth of the inner judge. The moment you become the one who knows, the one who evaluates, the one who stands apart from life and calls it acceptable or unacceptable, you lose the direct experience of unity. You do not lose it because it is taken away. You lose it because you're no longer looking from it. The kingdom of heaven becomes over there. God becomes out there. Peace becomes later. Salvation becomes after I fix the world. And meanwhile, the separate self becomes the permanent project. How do we go back? Not by time travel. Not by pretending the world is fine. Not by spiritual bypassing. Not by telling victims to just forgive and be quiet. We go back by dissolving the illusion at the root. We go back by seeing through the separate self, not as a concept, but as an experience. Here's a simple way to start, and you can do it right now. Bring to mind something you strongly judge. Someone you see as evil, or someone you see as a savior, or a situation you are obsessed with fixing. Notice what happens in your body as you do this. There will be tension. There will be a story. There will be a sense of me who is threatened or me who must defeat something. Now ask a very simple question. Where is this me? Not as a philosophical question, as an honest search in experience. When you look, you will find sensations, tightness in the chest, pressure in the face, a knot in the stomach. You will find images, a mental picture of the person, a mental movie of what happened. You will find thoughts, arguments, labels, conclusions. But do you find an actual separate entity in the middle of all that? Or do you just find a field of awareness with content moving through it? This is the doorway back to Eden, because Eden is not a place where nothing difficult happens. Eden is the recognition that the me who is constantly fighting reality is a mental construction. And when that construction softens, something else becomes available. A different intelligence, a different love, a different kind of strength. Not the strength of rage, not the strength of superiority, the strength of clear seeing. From that place you can still say, this must stop. You can still intervene. You can still protect the vulnerable. You can still build systems that reduce harm. But you do it without feeding the inner engine that creates endless enemies. You do it without making your identity depend on the existence of evil. You do it without turning the world into a permanent moral war. This is why the teaching is so threatening to the ego. The ego does not just enjoy good and dislike evil. It needs evil. It needs a villain to define itself against. It needs something to blame to avoid feeling its own fear. It needs a crusade to feel meaningful. It needs the constant hit of righteousness. So when you say, maybe the deepest solution is to dissolve the separate self, the ego panics and says, that means we will let evil win. But that is the ego talking. It is the same voice that ate the fruit. The deeper truth is that dissolving the separate self is exactly what removes the fuel from evil, because most evil is born from separation, from fear, from scarcity, from dehumanization, from the desperate attempt to secure a fragile identity at any cost. This does not excuse harm. It explains its root, and it points to a solution deeper than the endless cycle of reaction. If you want to make this practical, try one small experiment for the next day. Just notice how often your mind labels things as good or evil. Not in the obvious moral sense, in the subtle, constant sense. This is good for me. This is bad for me. This person is on my side. This person is against me. This feeling should not be here. This moment should be different. Every label quietly creates a separate self. And every time you see that happening, do one simple thing. Pause. Feel your body. And remember, the label is a thought in awareness. The thought is not reality. The separate self is a story that rides on those labels. You do not have to force yourself to stop judging. Just see it clearly. And in that seeing, for a moment, you will taste something like Eden. Not as a fantasy, as a direct experience of peace that is already here underneath the fight. And from that place, your action becomes cleaner. You still care. You still help. You still protect. But you stop feeding the illusion that we will reach heaven by defeating an enemy. Because the story is telling us the opposite. The moment we turned life into enemies and moral war, we lost the kingdom. And the way back is not more war, even when it is called holy, just, or necessary. The way back is seeing through the separate self and letting action come from unity. That is the deep, non-trivial message that got flattened into moralism. The tree was never about fruit. It was about a mind that believes it must divide reality to survive. And the invitation has always been the same. Come back. Not later. Now.